The grand ballroom of Buckingham Palace sparkled with golden chandeliers that cast warm light across hundreds of distinguished guests. Kate Middleton stood near the entrance, greeting diplomats and dignitaries with her characteristic grace and warmth. Her emerald green gown flowed elegantly as she moved, and her smile never faltered despite the exhaustion she felt deep in her bones. The evening's state banquet was in honor of the visiting president of France, and every detail had been planned to perfection. Crystal glasses clinked softly as guests mingled, their conversations creating a gentle hum that filled the ornate room. Kate had been preparing for this event for weeks, ensuring every protocol was followed and every guest felt welcomed. William stood across the room, engaged in conversation with several foreign ministers. Even from a distance, he could sense something was different about his wife tonight. There was a subtle tension in her shoulders, a slight hesitation in her movements that only he would notice after years of marriage. He made a mental note to check on her when the formal proceedings began. Kate excused herself from a conversation with the German ambassador's wife and took a moment to steady herself against a marble pillar. The room felt unusually warm, and she could feel a thin layer of perspiration forming despite the palace's excellent climate control. She attributed it to the stress of hosting such an important event and the heavy fabric of her formal gown. The palace staff moved efficiently around the edges of the room, ensuring every detail was perfect. Kate caught the eye of her personal secretary, who approached with a concerned expression. "Your Royal Highness, you look a bit pale. Perhaps you'd like some water." Kate waved off the concern with a gentle shake of her head. "I'm perfectly fine, thank you. Just the usual pre-dinner nerves." But even as she spoke, she felt a strange dizziness beginning to creep in at the edges of her consciousness. The French president and his wife entered the ballroom to a flourish of trumpets, and Kate immediately straightened, pushing aside any discomfort. Years of royal training had taught her to put duty above personal needs, and tonight was no exception. She walked forward to greet the honored guests, her public smile firmly in place. As the receiving line formed, Kate found herself shaking hands with an endless stream of people. Each interaction required focus and attention, remembering names and making appropriate conversation. The Spanish ambassador mentioned his daughter's upcoming wedding, and Kate offered warm congratulations. The Italian cultural attaché spoke about a new art exhibition, and Kate expressed genuine interest despite the growing fog in her mind. William finished his conversation and began making his way toward his wife. Something in her posture triggered his protective instincts. He had learned to read Kate's subtle signals over their years together, and tonight something felt wrong. Her smile seemed forced, and there was a slight tremor in her hand as she reached for another glass of water from a passing server. The formal call to dinner echoed through the ballroom, and guests began moving toward the state dining room. Kate took her position beside William, ready to lead the procession. The weight of tradition and expectation pressed down on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. She knew that hundreds of eyes were watching her every move, and the pressure to appear perfect was overwhelming. As they began walking, Kate felt the world start to shift slightly around her. The magnificent paintings on the walls seemed to blur at the edges, and the sound of footsteps on the marble floor became oddly distant. She gripped William's arm more tightly than usual, hoping he wouldn't notice her increasing dependence on his support. The state dining room was a masterpiece of royal grandeur. A massive table stretched the length of the room, set with the finest china and crystal the palace had to offer. Golden cutlery gleamed under the light of ancient chandeliers, and elaborate floral arrangements created a garden-like atmosphere. The sight should have filled Kate with pride and satisfaction, but instead, it made her feel overwhelmed and small. William guided Kate to her seat at the head table, his hand steady and reassuring on her back. He leaned in close as he helped her with her chair, his voice barely a whisper. "Are you all right, darling? You seem a bit off tonight." Kate turned to him with what she hoped was a convincing smile. "Just tired from all the preparations. You know how these events can be." But even as she spoke, she could feel her heart beginning to race in an alarming way. The corseted bodice of her gown suddenly felt restrictive, making it difficult to take deep breaths. The first course was served with ceremonial precision. Kate picked up her soup spoon, determined to maintain normalcy, but her hand felt strangely heavy. The delicate consommé in front of her looked unappetizing, and the rich aroma that usually would have pleased her now made her feel slightly nauseous. Conversation flowed around the table as guests discussed international relations, cultural exchanges, and economic partnerships. Kate participated when addressed directly, but found it increasingly difficult to follow the rapid shifts in topic. Her responses became shorter and more mechanical, though her years of training helped her maintain appropriate social graces. William watched his wife carefully throughout the meal, noting how she merely pushed food around her plate rather than eating. Her usual animated participation in dinner conversation had been replaced by polite but distant responses. When she reached for her wine glass, he noticed a slight tremor in her fingers that sent alarm bells ringing in his mind. The evening continued with its carefully orchestrated rhythm, but for Kate, time seemed to move in strange waves. Moments would pass in a blur, followed by periods where every second felt painfully slow. She found herself gripping the edge of the table for stability, hoping that the gesture appeared casual rather than desperate. As the main course was cleared away and dessert was being prepared, Kate realized that something was seriously wrong. The room had begun to feel like it was gently swaying, and maintaining her composure was becoming a monumental effort. She caught William's eye across the table and for just a moment, let her mask slip enough for him to see her genuine distress. William immediately recognized the look of distress in Kate's eyes. Years of marriage had taught him to read her expressions better than anyone else in the world. Behind her practiced smile, he could see fear and confusion that made his chest tighten with worry. He discreetly signaled to one of the palace staff members, requesting they bring Kate a glass of cool water. The dessert course arrived with its usual fanfare. An elaborate chocolate creation adorned with gold leaf was placed before each guest, accompanied by fresh berries and delicate sugarwork. The presentation was stunning, but Kate could barely focus on the plate in front of her. The rich smell of chocolate, usually one of her favorites, now made her stomach turn uncomfortably. Kate attempted to take a small bite of the dessert, but her hand shook as she lifted the spoon. The simple act of eating had become monumentally difficult, and she found herself struggling to swallow even the smallest portion. William watched with growing concern as she set down her utensil and pressed her fingertips to her temple in a gesture he recognized as her trying to ward off a headache. The French president was speaking about cultural cooperation between their nations, his words flowing eloquently in accented English. Other guests nodded and responded appropriately, but Kate found the conversation becoming increasingly distant and muffled, as if she were listening from underwater. She forced herself to nod at appropriate moments, but maintaining even this basic level of engagement was exhausting. William excused himself from his conversation with the Italian ambassador and moved closer to his wife. Under the pretense of sharing a private moment about the evening's success, he leaned in close enough to speak directly into her ear. "Kate, you're worrying me. Your color is all wrong and you're not yourself tonight." Kate turned to him with eyes that seemed slightly unfocused. "I'm just feeling a bit overwhelmed. The heat, the crowd, all the preparation stress catching up with me." Her voice was softer than usual, lacking its typical vibrancy. Even as she spoke, she could feel beads of perspiration forming along her hairline despite the comfortable temperature in the dining room. The palace physician, Dr. Harrison, was seated several tables away, enjoying his dinner as an honored guest. William caught his eye and gave a subtle signal that had been established for such situations. The doctor immediately understood and began making polite excuses to leave his table, ready to assist if needed. Kate tried to lift her water glass but found her coordination was becoming impaired. The simple task required more concentration than it should have, and she nearly knocked over the crystal stemware in the process. William smoothly reached over to steady the glass, his touch gentle but firm as he helped guide it to her lips. The cool water provided momentary relief, but Kate could feel her symptoms worsening. Her vision was beginning to tunnel slightly, and the ornate dining room with its golden walls and elaborate decorations seemed to be closing in around her. She gripped the edge of her chair, trying to ground herself in something solid and real. Guests around the table continued their animated discussions about trade agreements and diplomatic relations, unaware of the quiet crisis unfolding at the head table. Kate's training in royal protocol helped her maintain a facade of normalcy, but William could see through the performance. Her breathing had become shallow and rapid, and there was a glassy quality to her eyes that frightened him. The evening's entertainment was scheduled to begin shortly after dessert. A string quartet from the Royal Academy of Music was preparing to perform pieces by British and French composers, symbolizing the cultural bridge between the two nations. Kate knew she was expected to give introductory remarks, but the thought of standing and speaking to the assembled crowd filled her with panic. William made a decision. He quietly spoke to the master of ceremonies, suggesting that he handle the introduction to the evening's entertainment instead. The man looked surprised but quickly agreed, understanding that such changes sometimes occurred during formal events. William returned to Kate's side, relieved to have removed at least one pressure from her shoulders. Dr. Harrison had positioned himself near the dining room entrance, close enough to respond quickly if needed, but far enough away to avoid drawing attention. He watched Kate carefully, noting her pale complexion and the way she seemed to be fighting to maintain her composure. His medical training allowed him to recognize the early signs of what might be a significant health episode. Kate attempted to participate in a conversation with the German chancellor's wife about children's education initiatives, but found herself losing track of the discussion mid-sentence. Words that normally came easily to her seemed to require enormous effort to form. She felt as though she were speaking through thick fog, and maintaining logical thought patterns was becoming increasingly difficult. The string quartet began their performance with a beautiful piece by Vaughan Williams. The music was supposed to be soothing and elegant, but to Kate's heightened senses it seemed overwhelmingly loud and discordant. She pressed her hand to her forehead, trying to ease the pressure that was building behind her eyes like an approaching storm. William placed his hand gently on Kate's arm, offering silent support and reassurance. He could feel the tension in her muscles and the slight trembling that she was trying to suppress. His protective instincts were in full alert mode, but he also knew the importance of maintaining discretion in such a public setting. The performance continued with a piece by Debussy, its flowing melodies typically calming and beautiful, but Kate found herself unable to focus on the music or appreciate its artistry. The room seemed to be spinning very slowly, and she had to close her eyes briefly to try to regain her equilibrium. When she opened them again, William was studying her face with barely concealed alarm. Kate knew she needed to excuse herself, but the logistics seemed overwhelming. Standing up during the performance would draw attention, and she wasn't entirely sure her legs would support her weight. The formal protocol for such events didn't include provisions for sudden illness, and she felt trapped by the very tradition she had learned to navigate so skillfully. As the musical performance reached its crescendo, Kate felt her remaining strength beginning to ebb away like tide pulling back from the shore. The string quartet's final notes echoed through the dining room as polite applause filled the space. Kate managed to bring her hands together in appreciation, but the motion felt mechanical and distant. William noticed how her applause lacked its usual enthusiasm, and her hands seemed to move independently of her conscious control. The concerned expression on his face deepened as he watched her struggle with such a simple gesture. As guests began to shift in their seats, preparing for the transition back to the ballroom for coffee and liqueurs, Kate realized this would be her opportunity to excuse herself quietly. She turned to William, her voice barely above a whisper. "I need to step out for a moment. Just some fresh air." Her words came out slightly slurred, though she tried to speak clearly. William immediately stood ready to escort her, but Kate shook her head weakly. "Stay with the guests. I'll just be a moment." She knew that both of them leaving simultaneously would draw unwanted attention and potentially cause diplomatic concern. Royal protocol demanded that at least one of them remain visible and available to their international guests. Kate slowly pushed back her chair, using more effort than such a simple action should require. Her legs felt unsteady as she rose, and she had to grip the table edge for support. The room seemed to tilt slightly, and she paused for a moment, hoping the sensation would pass. Several guests glanced in her direction, but her years of training helped her maintain a composed expression. Dr. Harrison, who had been watching carefully from across the room, noticed Kate's unsteady movement immediately. He began making his way through the crowd of guests, excusing himself politely but with purpose. His medical instincts told him that whatever was happening to the Duchess was escalating beyond simple fatigue or stress. Kate walked slowly toward the dining room entrance, focusing intensely on each step. The marble floor beneath her feet felt uncertain, as if she were walking on a gently rocking ship. The elaborate tapestries and golden fixtures that lined the walls seemed to blur together in her peripheral vision, creating a disorienting kaleidoscope of colors and patterns. William watched his wife's careful progression across the room with growing alarm. Her usual graceful movement had been replaced by a cautious, deliberate gait that suggested she was fighting to maintain control. He caught the eye of their personal protection officer, who immediately understood the silent communication and began positioning himself closer to the exit. As Kate reached the doorway, she felt a wave of relief at the prospect of escaping the crowded, warm atmosphere of the dining room. The corridor beyond promised cooler air and blessed quiet away from the scrutiny of so many eyes. But as she stepped into the hallway, her vision began to blur more seriously, and the ornate ceiling above seemed to swim in and out of focus. The palace corridors, usually so familiar and comforting, now felt endless and maze-like. Kate placed one hand against the wall for support, trying to orient herself toward the nearest private sitting room. Each step required tremendous concentration, and she found herself counting them mentally just to maintain focus. 1 step, 2 steps, breathe, 3 steps, 4 steps. A young palace aide appeared in the corridor, carrying documents for the evening's proceedings. She looked up to see the Duchess moving slowly along the wall, and immediately approached with concern. "Your Royal Highness, are you quite well? Can I assist you with anything?" The aide's voice was respectful but filled with genuine worry. Kate tried to smile reassuringly, but even that facial expression felt difficult to maintain. "I'm just feeling a bit warm. Could you perhaps open a window in the blue drawing room?" She hoped that focusing on a specific practical request would help her maintain the appearance of normalcy while giving her a destination and purpose. The aide hurried ahead to prepare the room as requested, but not before Kate noticed the concerned glance she cast back over her shoulder. Word would likely reach the senior staff within minutes, and Kate knew she had very little time before her condition became a matter of official concern rather than personal discomfort. Meanwhile, back in the dining room, William was making polite conversation with the French delegation while keeping one eye on the doorway through which Kate had disappeared. His ability to multitask and maintain diplomatic composure while worrying about his wife was a skill developed through years of royal duty. But tonight it was being tested to its limits. Dr. Harrison finally reached William's side, speaking in low tones that wouldn't carry to nearby guests. "Your Highness, I believe the Duchess may need medical attention. I've observed several concerning symptoms throughout the evening." William nodded grimly, having reached the same conclusion himself. Kate finally reached the blue drawing room, a smaller, more intimate space decorated in soothing shades of blue and cream. The aide had opened the tall windows as requested, and cooler evening air was beginning to circulate through the room. Kate sank gratefully into one of the antique chairs, hoping that rest and fresh air would help her recover. But instead of improvement, Kate felt her symptoms continuing to worsen. The room, despite its smaller size and cooler temperature, seemed to be spinning slowly around her. She closed her eyes and tried to focus on breathing deeply, but even that automatic function required conscious effort. Her heart was racing irregularly, and she could feel her pulse pounding in her temples. The aide returned with a glass of cool water and a damp cloth, both of which Kate accepted gratefully. The cool water helped momentarily, but she found it difficult to hold the glass steady. When she tried to place it on the side table, her hand shook so badly that the aide quickly stepped forward to help, preventing the glass from falling. Kate knew she needed to return to the banquet soon, as her prolonged absence would eventually be noticed and could create diplomatic awkwardness. But the thought of standing up again, walking back through those corridors and resuming her hostess duties felt impossible. The simple act of sitting upright in the chair was requiring all of her remaining energy. Through the open windows, she could hear the distant sounds of London evening traffic and the normal activities of life continuing outside the palace walls. The contrast between that ordinary world and her current extraordinary circumstances felt surreal. Here she was, surrounded by luxury and privilege, yet feeling more vulnerable and frightened than she had in years. Kate tried to stand, determined to return to her duties, but as she rose from the chair, the room began to spin more violently. Her legs felt like they were made of water, and she had to immediately sink back down to avoid falling. The realization that she was truly incapacitated hit her with a force that was almost as overwhelming as her physical symptoms. The aide who had been helping Kate noticed her unsuccessful attempt to stand and immediately knelt beside the chair with growing concern. "Your Royal Highness, please don't try to get up just yet. You're looking very pale, and I think you should rest a bit longer." Her voice carried the kind of gentle authority that comes from genuine care rather than protocol. Kate nodded weakly, grateful for the permission to remain seated. She was beginning to realize that whatever was happening to her was beyond simple fatigue or stress. The symptoms were intensifying rather than improving with rest, and she felt a growing sense of alarm about her condition. Her medical knowledge, limited though it was, suggested that something significant was occurring. In the dining room, the formal portion of the evening was concluding, and guests were beginning to move toward the ballroom for the final social hour of the event. William smoothly handled the transition, making appropriate remarks about the successful cultural exchange and thanking the visiting dignitaries for their participation. But his attention was divided, and several astute observers noticed his frequent glances toward the doorway. Dr. Harrison remained close to William, ready to leave the moment he received permission. The doctor's trained eye had catalogued Kate's symptoms throughout the evening, and he was developing theories about what might be causing her distress. His medical bag was always present at such events, tucked discreetly in an antechamber, and he was mentally reviewing its contents and their potential applications. Kate attempted once more to rise from her chair, moving very slowly and deliberately. This time she managed to get to her feet, but the effort left her feeling dizzy and nauseous. She stood still for several moments, one hand gripping the chair back, waiting for the sensation to pass. The aide remained close by, ready to provide support if needed. The walk back toward the dining room felt like an enormous journey. Kate moved carefully along the corridor, one hand trailing along the wall for support. Her usual confident stride had been replaced by small, cautious steps. Each doorway and turn in the corridor required her to pause and gather her strength before continuing. Meanwhile, the French president had approached William to express his appreciation for the evening's hospitality. The conversation required William's full diplomatic attention, but he found it increasingly difficult to concentrate on trade discussions and cultural initiatives when his wife was clearly unwell. He managed appropriate responses while internally calculating how quickly he could excuse himself. Kate finally reached the entrance to the dining room, but the sight of the crowd and the warm, bustling atmosphere made her feel overwhelmed again. The sounds of conversation and laughter seemed unnaturally loud, and the movement of people felt chaotic and disorienting. She paused in the doorway, trying to summon the energy to rejoin the gathering. William spotted Kate immediately upon her return and was alarmed by her appearance. Even from across the room, he could see that her color was worse than when she had left. Her usual vibrant presence seemed diminished, and there was something fragile about the way she held herself that triggered every protective instinct he possessed. Kate attempted to make her way back to her seat, but the distance across the room felt impossibly long. Guests continued their conversations around her, most unaware of her struggle. She managed polite nods and brief smiles when directly addressed, but maintaining even these basic social responses was depleting her remaining energy reserves. Dr. Harrison watched Kate's careful progress with professional concern. Her gait was unsteady, and her facial expression suggested she was fighting significant symptoms. He began moving through the crowd toward her, using his knowledge of the room's layout to position himself along her likely path. As Kate navigated between tables, she felt the world beginning to shift more dramatically around her. The elegant dining room with its golden walls and crystal chandelier started to blur at the edges of her vision. She reached for a chair back to steady herself, but her depth perception was becoming unreliable, and she nearly missed her target. William excused himself from his conversation mid-sentence, his diplomatic training warring with his concern for his wife. The French president looked momentarily surprised but quickly understood when he followed William's gaze and saw Kate's obvious distress. Protocol could be flexible when human welfare was at stake. Kate was now only a few steps from her chair, but those final steps felt like climbing a mountain. Her legs were trembling with the effort of supporting her weight, and her breathing had become shallow and rapid. She could feel perspiration on her forehead, despite the comfortable temperature in the room, and her heart was beating irregularly. The palace staff, trained to notice even small irregularities during formal events, had begun to take note of the situation. Experienced servers and protocol officers positioned themselves strategically around the room, ready to assist if needed, while maintaining the discretion that such events required. Their years of service had taught them to handle unexpected situations smoothly. William reached Kate's side, just as she was attempting to lower herself into her chair. He could see that her hands were shaking, and her movements lacked their usual coordination. "Kate, darling, you don't look well at all. I think we need to get you some proper attention." His voice was low but filled with urgency and love. Kate looked up at her husband with eyes that seemed slightly unfocused. "I think something's really wrong, William. This isn't just tiredness." Her admission of vulnerability was significant given her usual determination to fulfill her duties regardless of personal discomfort. The fact that she was acknowledging the severity of her symptoms alarmed William even more. Dr. Harrison arrived at their table, his presence both reassuring and concerning. "Your Royal Highness, I'd like to check a few things if you don't mind." Nothing intrusive, just some basic observations. His voice was calm and professional, but Kate could see the worry in his experienced eyes. The guests around them were beginning to notice that something unusual was happening. Conversations became more subdued, and several diplomatic spouses looked on with concern. The evening's carefully orchestrated flow was beginning to shift as attention focused on the head table and the obvious distress of their hostess. Kate attempted to wave off the doctor's concerns, not wanting to create a scene at such an important diplomatic event. "I'm sure I'll be fine in a moment. Perhaps just some more water?" But even as she spoke, she could feel her condition continuing to deteriorate, and the prospect of completing the evening's obligations seemed increasingly impossible. Dr. Harrison discreetly positioned himself beside Kate's chair, his medical training allowing him to assess her condition without drawing excessive attention from the other guests. He noted her rapid pulse, shallow breathing, and the way her pupils seemed slightly dilated. These signs, combined with her pale complexion and obvious disorientation, painted a concerning picture that required immediate attention. William moved closer to his wife, creating a protective barrier between her and the curious glances of other guests. His years of experience in handling public situations while managing private crises served him well, but the fear he felt for Kate's well-being was unlike anything he had experienced during their years together. Her obvious vulnerability struck him deeply. Kate tried once more to participate in the evening's activities, turning toward the German Chancellor's wife who was speaking about environmental initiatives. But the words seemed to float past her without meaning, and she found herself unable to formulate appropriate responses. The simple act of following a conversation required more mental energy than she could summon. The French president's wife, a gracious woman with decades of experience in diplomatic settings, noticed Kate's distress and smoothly began redirecting conversations away from her, giving her space to recover without creating obvious awkwardness. Such social graces were part of the unspoken code among diplomatic spouses who understood the pressures of public life. Dr. Harrison leaned closer to Kate, speaking in tones that wouldn't carry beyond their immediate circle. "Your Royal Highness, I'd like to take your pulse if I may. Just place your hand on the table and I'll be very discreet." His approach was professional but gentle, understanding the delicate balance required in such a public setting. Kate extended her hand, grateful for the doctor's calming presence. As his fingers found her pulse point, she could see the slight frown that crossed his features. Her heart rate was not only rapid but irregular, skipping beats in a pattern that concerned him. He maintained his composed expression while making mental notes about her condition. William watched the doctor's subtle examination with growing anxiety. He had known Dr. Harrison for years and could read the barely perceptible signs of concern in the physician's professional demeanor. The fact that the doctor was taking such a direct interest in Kate's condition, despite the public setting, told William that the situation was more serious than simple fatigue. Kate felt another wave of dizziness wash over her, this one stronger than the previous episodes. The ornate dining room seemed to tilt and sway around her, and she gripped the edge of the table to maintain her equilibrium. The sensation was frightening and disorienting, unlike anything she had experienced before in her life. The carefully orchestrated conclusion of the formal dinner was approaching, and guests would soon be moving to the ballroom for coffee and final conversations before departing. Kate knew she was expected to lead this transition, but the thought of standing and walking filled her with dread. Her legs felt weak and unsteady, and she wasn't sure they would support her weight. Dr. Harrison completed his discreet examination and leaned back slightly, his expression grave but controlled. He caught William's eye and gave a barely perceptible shake of his head that communicated volumes. The situation required immediate medical attention, but the challenge was managing it without creating a diplomatic incident or public spectacle. William made a quick decision. He signaled to the master of ceremonies, who approached their table with professional efficiency. In whispered tones, William explained that the Duchess was feeling unwell and that he would handle the transition to the ballroom alone. The experienced staff member nodded understanding and began preparing to adjust the evening's protocol accordingly. Kate heard William's conversation and felt a mixture of relief and disappointment. Relief that she wouldn't have to continue performing her duties in her current condition, but disappointment that she was failing in her responsibilities as hostess. Her sense of duty had been ingrained through years of royal training, and stepping back felt like a personal failure. The guests began their migration toward the ballroom, led by William, who managed to maintain his composure while his thoughts remained focused on his wife's condition. He made appropriate conversation with the departing dignitaries while keeping one eye on Kate, who remained seated at the head table with Dr. Harrison staying close by her side. As the dining room gradually emptied, Kate felt some of the pressure lifting from her shoulders. The constant scrutiny and need to maintain perfect composure had been exhausting in her weakened state. But rather than feeling better with the reduced stress, her symptoms seemed to be intensifying. The dizziness was becoming more pronounced, and waves of nausea were beginning to accompany it. Dr. Harrison waited until most of the guests had departed before speaking more openly. "Your Royal Highness, I'm quite concerned about your symptoms. Your pulse is irregular, and you're showing signs that suggest we need to get you somewhere quiet for a proper examination. This isn't something that should be ignored." Kate nodded weakly, finally allowing herself to acknowledge the severity of her situation. "I've never felt anything like this before. It started gradually during dinner, but it's getting much worse." Her voice was softer than usual, and there was a vulnerability in her tone that Dr. Harrison found concerning, given her usual strength and resilience. William returned to the dining room, after ensuring the guests were settled in the ballroom with appropriate entertainment and refreshments. His diplomatic duties had been temporarily delegated to other senior royals who understood the situation. His priority now was entirely focused on his wife's well-being, and protocol could be adjusted as necessary. The palace staff had discreetly cleared the immediate area around Kate's chair, creating a buffer zone that provided privacy, while maintaining the appearance that everything was under control. Years of experience had taught them how to handle unexpected situations with minimal disruption to ongoing events. Kate attempted to stand once more, determined to at least move to a more private location where she could receive proper medical attention. But as she rose from her chair, the world around her began to spin violently. Her vision tunneled dramatically, and she felt her knees beginning to buckle beneath her. The strength she had been fighting to maintain finally began to abandon her completely. Dr. Harrison immediately positioned himself to provide support, his medical instincts taking over as he recognized the signs of an impending collapse. William rushed to Kate's other side, his face pale with concern as he saw his wife's condition deteriorating so rapidly. Together they formed a protective circle around her as her body began to fail her. Kate's vision narrowed to a small tunnel of light as the elegant dining room faded around her. Her legs, which had been trembling with the effort of supporting her, finally gave way completely. She felt herself falling backward, but the sensation seemed to happen in slow motion, as if she were floating rather than collapsing. The last thing she saw clearly was William's face, filled with alarm and love, reaching toward her. William's reflexes kicked in instantly. Years of military training and protective instincts had prepared him for crisis situations, though nothing could have prepared him emotionally for seeing his wife in such distress. He lunged forward, catching Kate just as her body went limp, his strong arms wrapping around her to prevent her from hitting the marble floor. Dr. Harrison immediately moved into action, his medical training taking precedence over all social protocols. He helped William lower Kate gently to the floor, positioning her so that her airway remained clear and her circulation wouldn't be compromised. His hands moved efficiently to check her pulse and breathing while maintaining the calm demeanor that came from years of Emergency medical experience. The few remaining palace staff members who witnessed Kate's collapse sprang into coordinated action. Years of training for various emergency scenarios had prepared them for such moments, and they moved with quiet efficiency to secure the area and ensure privacy. Within seconds, the dining room was cleared of any unnecessary personnel, and the entrances were discreetly monitored. Kate's collapse had been sudden and complete. Her body lay still in William's arms, her face peaceful but alarmingly pale. Her breathing was shallow but steady, and her pulse, while still irregular, remained strong enough to provide some reassurance to Dr. Harrison. The elegant emerald gown that had looked so beautiful earlier now seemed to emphasize her fragility. William held Kate close, his voice urgent but controlled as he spoke to her unconscious form. "Kate, darling, can you hear me? Please wake up." His hands gently brushed her hair away from her face, and he could feel the slight dampness of perspiration on her forehead. The fear in his eyes was barely contained, though his voice remained steady. Dr. Harrison worked quickly to assess Kate's condition. He checked her pupils with a small pen light, noting their response to light and their relative size. Her blood pressure, taken with equipment that had been discreetly brought from his medical bag, showed concerning readings that confirmed his suspicions about the severity of her condition. The master of ceremonies appeared at Dr. Harrison's shoulder, his face grave with concern. "Doctor, what do you need? Should we call for an ambulance? We have a medical facility here in the palace, but if she needs hospital care..." His voice trailed off as he waited for medical guidance, ready to coordinate whatever response was necessary. Dr. Harrison considered their options carefully. Moving Kate in her current state could be risky, but the palace medical facility, while well equipped for basic care, wasn't designed for serious emergencies. "Let's get her to the palace medical room first. I need to stabilize her and determine what we're dealing with before making any decisions about transport." William carefully lifted Kate in his arms, surprised by how light she felt. Her head rested against his shoulder, and he could feel her breathing against his neck, which provided some comfort despite the circumstances. The walk to the medical facility felt endless, though it was only a few corridors away from the dining room. The palace medical room was efficiently equipped with modern diagnostic equipment and emergency supplies. Dr. Harrison had insisted on certain upgrades over the years, understanding that medical emergencies could occur at any time during royal events. The space, while compact, was designed to handle a variety of situations until professional hospital care could be arranged if necessary. William gently placed Kate on the examination table, reluctant to let go of her even for medical necessity. He positioned himself close enough to provide comfort if she regained consciousness, but far enough away to allow Dr. Harrison the space he needed to work. His hands remained within reach of hers, ready to provide reassurance the moment she awakened. Dr. Harrison connected Kate to monitoring equipment that would track her heart rate, blood pressure, and oxygen levels continuously. The rhythmic beeping of the monitors provided some comfort, confirming that her vital signs, while concerning, remained stable. He began a more thorough examination, checking reflexes and responses that would help him understand what had caused her collapse. Meanwhile, in the ballroom, the evening's activities continued under the capable management of senior palace staff. The guests had been informed that the Duchess was feeling slightly unwell and had retired for the evening, but that the celebration would continue as planned. Such diplomatic explanations were part of the delicate balance required in royal protocol. Kate's breathing remained steady, but shallow, and her color was gradually improving in the cooler, quieter environment of the medical room. Dr. Harrison noted these positive signs while continuing his assessment. Her pulse, while still irregular, seemed to be stabilizing somewhat, though he remained concerned about the underlying cause of her symptoms. William found himself studying his wife's peaceful face, noting details he rarely had time to observe during their busy public lives. Even unconscious, she maintained the dignity and grace that had made her such a beloved public figure. But seeing her so vulnerable and still filled him with a protective tenderness that overwhelmed his usual composure. Dr. Harrison completed his preliminary examination and turned to William with a serious expression. "Your Highness, the Duchess appears to have experienced what we call a vasovagal episode, possibly triggered by stress, dehydration, or other factors. Her vital signs are stabilizing, but I'm concerned about the irregular heartbeat I detected earlier." William felt a mixture of relief and continued worry. The medical terminology was somewhat reassuring, suggesting that Kate's condition had a name and potentially a treatment. But the doctor's serious tone indicated that the situation was far from resolved. What does that mean for her recovery? Will she be all right? Before Dr. Harrison could respond, Kate's eyelids began to flutter slightly, the first sign that she might be regaining consciousness. William immediately moved closer, taking her hand gently in his and speaking softly. "Kate, it's William. You're safe now. Can you hear me?" His voice carried all the love and concern he felt, hoping that familiar sounds might help guide her back to full awareness. Kate's eyes opened slowly, confusion evident as she tried to understand where she was and what had happened. The medical room's bright light seemed harsh after her period of unconsciousness, and she blinked several times trying to focus. William's face gradually came into view, and she could see the worry and relief mingled in his expression. Kate's eyes focused gradually on William's worried face, and she felt the comforting warmth of his hand holding hers. The sterile environment of the medical room was disorienting at first, but his presence provided an anchor of familiarity in her confusion. She tried to speak, but her voice came out as barely a whisper. "William? What happened? Where am I?" William's relief at hearing her voice was immense, though he could see she was still weak and disoriented. "You collapsed during the banquet, darling. You're in the palace medical room with Dr. Harrison. You gave us quite a scare." His voice was gentle and reassuring, but she could hear the underlying tension that revealed how frightened he had been. Dr. Harrison approached the examination table with a warm but professional smile. "Your Royal Highness, it's good to see you awake. You've been unconscious for about 20 minutes. I know you must be confused, but you're in a safe place, and your vital signs are improving." His calm manner helped ease some of Kate's disorientation. Kate tried to sit up, but a wave of dizziness immediately reminded her of her condition. She lay back down carefully, allowing her body to adjust gradually to being conscious again. "I remember feeling unwell during dinner, but everything after that is rather fuzzy. Did I really collapse in front of all those people?" The embarrassment was evident in her voice. William squeezed her hand gently. "You made it through most of the evening beautifully. Only a few people witnessed what happened, and the staff handled everything discreetly. The guests think you simply retired early feeling unwell." His words were chosen carefully to ease her concern about the diplomatic implications of her collapse. Dr. Harrison had been monitoring Kate's responses carefully since she regained consciousness. Her mental clarity seemed to be returning, and her physical responses were improving, though he remained concerned about the irregular heartbeat that had preceded her collapse. "Your Royal Highness, I'd like to ask you a few questions about how you're feeling now and what you experienced before you collapsed." Kate nodded weakly, still holding William's hand for comfort and stability. "I started feeling dizzy and warm during dinner. My heart was racing and I felt increasingly disoriented. I thought it was just stress from hosting such an important event." She paused, remembering the frightening moments before she lost consciousness, but it kept getting worse instead of better. Dr. Harrison made notes as she spoke, building a clearer picture of the episode. "Have you been experiencing any unusual stress lately? Any changes in your sleep patterns, diet, or medication? Sometimes these episodes can be triggered by a combination of factors that might seem minor individually, but create problems when combined." Kate considered his questions carefully. The past few weeks had indeed been more stressful than usual, with increased public engagements, preparations for several major events, and the constant pressure of public scrutiny. "I suppose I have been pushing myself harder than usual lately. There have been so many obligations and I always want to fulfill them perfectly." William looked at his wife with a mixture of love and gentle reproach. "You've been taking on too much, Kate. I've been worried about how tired you've seemed lately, but you always insist you're fine." His voice carried the concern of someone who had watched his partner push herself beyond reasonable limits. Dr. Harrison nodded understanding. The combination of stress, insufficient rest, and the pressure of public appearances can sometimes trigger what we call a vasovagal response. Your nervous system essentially became overwhelmed and caused a temporary shutdown to protect itself. It's not uncommon, but it is a warning that your body needs attention. Kate felt a deep sense of gratitude for the medical explanation. Having a name for what had happened made it seem less frightening and more manageable. "So this isn't something seriously wrong with my heart or brain? I was terrified that something major was happening to me. Her relief was evident in her voice. Dr. Harrison's expression remained serious but reassuring. While the episode itself appears to be stress-related, I am concerned about the irregular heartbeat I detected. I'd like to run some additional tests and possibly have you seen by a cardiac specialist to ensure there aren't any underlying issues that need attention. William felt his anxiety return at the mention of heart problems. The royal family's medical history included some cardiac concerns, and the thought of Kate facing such issues filled him with fear. What kind of tests, and how soon can we arrange them? His protective instincts were fully engaged as he considered the next steps. Kate slowly tried sitting up again, this time moving more gradually and allowing her body to adjust. William immediately moved to support her, his arm around her shoulders providing both physical and emotional stability. She felt weak but more like herself than she had during the frightening hours of the evening. Dr. Harrison helped adjust the examination table so Kate could sit more comfortably. I'd recommend a comprehensive cardiac evaluation, including an ECG, echocardiogram, and possibly a stress test. Nothing invasive, but thorough enough to ensure we understand what happened and prevent future episodes. The implications of medical testing and potential cardiac concerns weighed heavily on both Kate and William. Their public roles meant that any health issues would require careful management to maintain confidence while ensuring proper care. Kate had always prided herself on her strength and reliability, and the thought of health limitations was difficult to accept. Kate looked at William, seeing her own concerns reflected in his eyes. I suppose this means slowing down a bit, doesn't it? Being more careful about taking on too many commitments? The adjustment to their carefully planned lives would require significant changes, but her health had to take priority. William nodded firmly. Your health comes first, always. We'll adjust our schedule, delegate more responsibilities, and make sure you have time to rest and recover properly. The public obligations will have to accommodate your well-being, not the other way around. His determination to protect her was absolute. Dr. Harrison smiled at their exchange, pleased to see them approaching the situation as a team. With proper rest, stress management, and regular monitoring, there's no reason why this should be a recurring problem. The key is listening to your body's signals before they become emergencies. Kate felt William's arm tighten around her shoulders, and she leaned into his strength gratefully. The evening that had started with such promise and ended in such fear was finally resolving into something manageable. With proper medical care and the support of her husband, she could face whatever adjustments were needed. As the immediate crisis passed, Kate began to appreciate how quickly and effectively everyone had responded to her emergency. From Dr. Harrison's professional care to William's unwavering support to the palace staff's discreet efficiency, she had been surrounded by people who genuinely cared about her well-being beyond her public role. The realization that she needed to take better care of herself was sobering, but also liberating. Perhaps this frightening episode would ultimately lead to a healthier balance between duty and personal well-being, ensuring many more years of effective service without compromising her health.